Hi guys, and welcome to another video. In this one we're going to be going over the recommended .NET way of handling global exceptions. So let's dive right into this immediately with a code example. We have here a bare bones template web API with the standard weather forecast controller, and we're going to go to the get function and we're going to throw an exception with the text something went wrong. Now, if we go and we run this, it will open up a Swagger page, and if we execute it, this is the response we get. Notice that the error that is returned to the user isn't particularly nice to read. It shows our entire stack trace, and we really want to avoid that. Now, the obvious solution to this is to have a try-catch block, catch an exception, and then return a status code such as a bad request. But the problem with that approach is that your code will end up littered with lots of try-catch blocks. It will make your code really ugly and a lot more difficult to read and a lot more difficult to follow the flows. So the way that Microsoft recommends is that you create a controller specifically for your errors. So let's do this by creating a new controller. We'll call this our error handling controller. We need to give it a couple of attributes. So we'll give it an attribute of API controller. And we need to give it a root. And we will give it a root with the name of controller between these square brackets. Now, what this will do by just specifying controller, it will use the class name as its root, but excluding the controller part from the class name. So in this situation, the root for this controller will be error handling. And finally, we also need to inherit this from controller base. Now, let's write our initial function. We want to return an action result. So we'll do a public iAction result, and it will be called handle error. It doesn't need any arguments. And what we're going to do is we're going to tap into the HTTP context features, and we'll just create this as a variable called exception handler feature, and we can say HTTP context dot features dot get, and then what we want to get is a type of iExceptionHandler feature. From here, we can create an exception variable, and we can get our exception that was thrown from this feature. This is complaining because it could be null, so just to keep it quiet, I'm going to tell it that it's absolutely definitely not null. And now let's implement the rest of our class, and for now we'll just return a problem, which will return a problem details in the end, with the message, uh-oh. Now that we've got our error handling controller in place, we need to go to our program class, and right at the bottom, just above the app.run, we need to say use exception handler, and here we pass in the root to our controller. So it's / error handling. Now we should be able to run this again, but when we run this, you'll notice a slight issue. Swagger can't load its definition anymore. And that's because in our controller, it's looking at this and it's saying, hey, I don't know what this is. I don't know if this is a get, if this is a post. So normally you would specify HTTP get or HTTP post. In this case, it would be get. But in this situation, we actually don't want Swagger to ever display this. It's a purely internal endpoint. It's never going to be displayed to a user, and we want Swagger to treat it as such. So what we can do is we can add another attribute, and we can say API Explorer settings, and then we can say ignore API equal to true. And that means Swagger will never display this. It will completely ignore it. Let's run this again. And rerun. And you see this time we get a standard response back. This is a problem details response, and it's part of the HTTP standard, as you can see there in the RFC. And you can even see our little detail in the message as well as the status code. Now, that's quite nice, but we can make this a little bit better. let's add a custom exception. We'll call this a not found exception. This will inherit from exception. We will have a single constructor that takes the string of message and calls its base with that string. Now we'll go over to our weather forecast controller, and rather than this, we'll remove this empty code as well. We will throw a not found exception, and we will call it item not found. Now we can go back to our error handling controller, and this is where we can make use of the actual exception. We can now do things like add if statements. So we can say if exception is a type of not found exception, and we'll also give this a name so we can use it within its if block. We can then say, oh, we'll return the problem. And this time the detail will be not found exception.message. We won't provide an instance, and our status code, because it's not found, will be 404. Now, let's rerun this and see what we get. So what you see is you get the same response type. It's always going to be a problem details, but now we've got the detail of item not found, we've got a new status code, and .NET handles the title for you. So it notices that you're returning a 404, so it specifies, okay, the title is now not found. Before, when it was the 500, it was internal server error. You can also override this if you want as extra arguments on here. You can see we've got the title and also the type if you want to return it. The nice thing about this is that we can also add logging to this controller, so we can handle all of our logging for our exceptions in one place, our global exceptions, our exceptions that have bubbled up, as well as handling our exceptions in that case. It makes your codebase a lot cleaner to manage and a lot nicer to read. That's going to be it for this video, guys. If you found it useful, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers!